MacRitchie Reservoir.
MacRitchie Reservoir.
I see you at the movies. I see you with your lipstick on.
Okay, so if you guys like look around here, you can see some of the tadpoles. Also, there was just a family who was throwing these little chunks of bread, which obviously aren't what a typical tadpole would eat.
A foreign substance going into the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Now we're seeing bigger fish.
Okay, so although it's kind of been hard to see, we think that we have saw another primary consumer in the freshwater ecosystem, and those are the pond skaters, which are the insects, and those typically feed on the larvae of the tadpoles, which are normally at the top of the pond. And since there are a ton of tadpoles here, it would make sense that the pond skaters would also be in this general area. So that would also be a predation relationship. The pond skaters eat the tadpole larvae.
So in this freshwater ecosystem, we have notified the Singapore rhododendron, which is the primary producer of this ecosystem, and it is the most popular primary producer as well, because they're seen all over here. So this would also make them an autotroph because they do take photons from the sun and photosynthesize it. Now gonna go into the rainforest ecosystem.
And then also there's just a list here that we saw. These are kind of some of the disturbances you could see that are also obviously all human based. So there are disturbances such as like wildfires, but those are all natural, and these are ways that we could obviously protect the animals. And if humans were not to follow these rules, that would cause a really big disturbance in all of the ecosystems and the animal species population.
It says please do not fish here because they don't want to cause a disturbance to the ecosystem.
Fishing in this instance would be a disturbance, as well as feeding the animals or the macaques.
We actually wanted to go down here, but this is where we were planning on going down, but the boardwalk is closed for maintenance.
This would just be an area where we could possibly see some more freshwater species, but we'll just go more into the rainforest.
Yeah. I see you with your lipstick on. I'm looking out for cosmos.
This is one of the primary consumers in the ecosystem as well.
The common blue sprite damselfly. Those are the long-tailed macaques, and they are the secondary consumer.
So these long-tailed macaques are omnivores. So they'll typically eat fruits, seeds, roots, and tree bark. And the crab-eating macaques consume crab and will also eat other animals.
We think it's a secondary consumer because it eats both sort of the plants and the smaller animals. And it doesn't really eat that much meat unless it's the crab macaques. So we don't believe it would be the keystone species.
So we just got home from MacRitchie Reservoir, and now we're going to talk to you guys. Although we did see some of the things that we were planning on seeing and that we researched, we didn't really see the entire food chains. We researched 2 different food chains, and we didn't get to see the entirety of those food chains. So now we're going to go through them and explain them to you.
We're gonna start off with the freshwater ecosystem, and we actually were able to find quite a few of the species. So we'll just briefly go through that one so you can go more in depth on the ones that we weren't able to see at all.
Okay, so the primary producer of the freshwater ecosystem, we kind of already saw and we already talked about, but once again, I'll just say it again. It was called the Singapore rhododendron, and I think I butchered the name, but the scientific name is Melastoma malabathricum. And it's the most common plant throughout the ecosystem. It's kind of like a lightish pink, bright flower. And like I said before, it is an autotroph. So it does use the photons from the sun to photosynthesize, and it does provide the area with oxygen as well.
So we're gonna go in order, and so we just talked about the primary producer, and then we have 2 primary consumers, so we'll each talk about one, and then we'll also talk about the competition within that. So we actually did get to see both of them, and the first one is the pond skater. So I'm not sure if it showed up very well in the video, but the pond skaters were about this big, and they're kind of just like insects with really long legs, kind of creepy looking, but they typically stay on the surface of ponds because they eat the larvae of tadpoles, and that's normally like they float to the surface before they hatch. So they'll just kind of it's almost as if they're jumping around, but they'll kind of jump around the pond, and then that's how they get their food. So again, it's a predation relationship, and we found them to be a primary consumer because obviously they're quite small, so other lizards and other species in the ecosystem could easily eat them, but they're also still eating the tadpole larvae.
So the second primary consumer that we're going to be talking about is the tadpoles, and I think we were able to pick it up on video when we were actually at MacRitchie Reservoir, but it was kind of like the footage, they're really small and we don't have the best quality camera, so we're not sure if that actually was picked up. But they basically just eat algae and microplants, which are things that grow inside of the ponds. They actually do get eaten by water lizards, so that's probably their main predator, along with the pond skaters that eat their larvae. So the pond skaters will eat the larvae, so before they're actually like fully developed into tadpoles, and then the water lizards will actually eat the fully developed tadpoles.
So we lied. There actually were 3 primary consumers that we found based on the research we did, and the last one was a carpenter bee. And although we did see them, we were unable to videotape it because it was when we were kind of just walking back, and there was like a swarm of bugs everywhere, so we got a little bit freaked out. So obviously we know bees pollinate flowers, and then they eat the nectar, and then they're able to spread it around. So then in specific regards to the primary producer, because it's a flower plant and it's not just a leaf and such, the carpenter bees are able to pollinate these flowers. So they kind of work in hand, and it's a mutualistic relationship between the two of them. In this specific environment that we were in, there aren't too many species that prey on the bees. However, typically large-sized lizards do prey on them if they are around the area. And so yeah, they pollinate the Singaporean rhododendron.
So I'm going to be talking about the first secondary consumer that we researched. It's called the little heron, and the scientific name is Budorides striatus, and we said that it was a secondary consumer because it does prey on the primary consumers, such as the pond skaters and the blue sprite damselfly that we actually were able to encounter at MacRitchie Reservoir, and I think we got some footage of that.
Hopefully you guys will be able to see it. It was quite small. So the next secondary consumer is the white-breasted water hen, and we actually weren't able to see either the birds, probably because they'd be flying, or they just weren't in the area where it was heavily populated with humans, because there were actually quite a lot of people out today. But so these, again, we labeled it a secondary consumer because they also eat the pond skaters and the damselfly. So it's typically more insects than it is any vegetation. The scientific name for it is the, I'm going to butcher this, Amanuronis phenoacurus. So yeah, that's the other secondary consumer.
The last time I freaked out.
So now we have 2 left, the keystone and the tertiary, so I'll be talking about the tertiary consumer. The tertiary consumer is called the red-eyed slider. The scientific name of it, I'm going to butcher this very well, the Trachemy scripta elegans. And actually one of the websites that I was looking on to find what they ate, or like what their food typically was, quoted, they will eat just about anything that you put in front of them. So they can eat anything in the environment so long as it's not the keystone species, which Chrissy will be talking about. But so that means that they'll eat the smaller lizards, the insects, the fish, like anything that's around them. And that is why we labeled the tertiary consumer, because they are just a little bit smaller than the keystone species. It makes them able to eat everything except for the keystone species, which is...
So the keystone species that we studied in this ecosystem is the monitor lizard, and we weren't able to see one. They are typically carnivores, so they'll feed off of like anything. Like they'll feed off of the eggs, the fish, the tadpoles, the birds, and smaller reptiles, and pretty much just everything that's in that environment. So they are typically carnivores, but they can also sometimes have a more omnivorous diet, because they sometimes will eat like the fruits around and more of the vegetation around as well. Mm-hmm. And that's why we said that this was a keystone species, because it pretty much eats everything in the environment. So without it, there would be a massive change in population sizes. So we just talked about the aquatic freshwater ecosystem at MacRitchie Reservoir, but now we're going to go into the food chain that we studied for the rainforest ecosystem at MacRitchie Reservoir. The primary producer that we studied for this ecosystem was the Tembusu tree, and this is a scientific name. It's called the Phrygia fragrans, and once again, like any typical primary producer, it is an autotroph, so it takes the photons from the sun and uses them to photosynthesize.
Yeah.
It just looks like any other tree, pretty much. There's no distinct features, and as you can see, we got some footage of us walking through the rainforest, and they're pretty much all over the place.
So one of the first ones that we found were crickets, pretty standard species anywhere in the world. But so the cricket scientific name is the Nitrius vittatus. Crickets are omnivores, as they'll eat both smaller fruits and then rotting meat. Because they're small, obviously it has to be broken down small, and they'll eat anything from rotting leaves on trees to small insects. And that's why we think it's a primary consumer, because it'll eat both the autotroph, so the primary producer, as well as some other species of the ecosystem and like insects and such. So I'll now be talking about another primary consumer in the environment, and this was also in the botanical gardens because they are both rainforest ecosystems, but it's the cicadas we were talking about. And the technical or scientific name for the cicadas is the Perna sp. We labeled the cicadas the primary consumers because they get their nutrients from the autotrophs and from the trees. So they eat or drink the sap of the tree, which is called the xylem. And the xylem is the watery fluid in the tree trunk, which is full of amino acids and nutrients for the cicadas.
Okay, so the next primary consumer that I'm going to be talking about is the green-crested lizard. And we actually did see one, I think. The scientific name of this is called the Bronchochlea cristalia. So pretty much they just eat beetles, flies, insects, and baby ants. So yeah, that's pretty much it about the green-crested lizard. Okay, so now I'm going to be talking about the red darter dragonfly, and this is the first secondary consumer that we're going to be talking about. I actually saw them while we were at MacRitchie, but I'm not sure if the footage was good because, first of all, they fly really
small,
fast, and they're so small, so it's really hard to see. Okay, so we're kind of on the fence whether it's a primary consumer or a secondary consumer because through our research, it was pretty vague as to what they do eat when it comes to living organisms, because it talks about how they eat small fish, but we're not really sure if that's small fish or if they mean like tadpoles. So
because the dragonflies themselves are like quite small.
They're quite small, yeah. But yeah, so pretty much they just eat bloodworms, insects, and just small fish. We're on the fence whether it's a primary consumer or a secondary consumer. So the next thing that we're going to be talking about is a secondary consumer that is called the greater racket-tailed drongo, and the scientific name is Dicerurus paradisus, and this is the reason why we're leaning more towards saying that the dragonfly that we previously talked about is a primary consumer, because the greater racket-tailed drongo is a secondary consumer and it feeds on dragonflies, so I'm assuming that the dragonfly that I talked about previously is a primary consumer. So pretty much this feeds on nectar, ants, bees, dragonflies, insects, and termites.
And the final secondary consumer we'll be talking about are the long-tailed macaques, very famous in Singapore. And the scientific name for them is Macaca fascicularis. So typically they are omnivores, especially if it's the crab-eating macaques. Obviously in the name, they'd be eating crabs. They'd be eating more of a seafood diet. The ones that we saw were not the crab-eating macaques, as there weren't any crabs really in that location at MacRitchie. And so those ones, they will typically eat fruits, seeds, roots, and tree bark. Therefore, because it eats a little bit more than the average primary consumer, and it's quite larger in size, we have been led to believe that it'd be a secondary consumer.
So the next secondary consumer is the elegant bronzeback snake. They eat primarily lizards and frogs, but they're also capable of eating birds and rodents. We believe that they're a secondary consumer also because they eat the green-crested lizard, which is a primary consumer in this ecosystem and food chain. So that's another reason why it gives us to believe that these are secondary consumers. Well, I'm now going to be talking about what we believe to be the tertiary consumer. It is called the white-throated kingfisher, and the scientific name is the Halcyon simensis. Pretty much eat insects, earthworms, rodents, fish, and frogs. So that's why we believe that they're tertiary, because they do eat rodents and frogs, and because they eat snakes. So that is why we believe it to be the tertiary consumer.
And so finally, we will be talking about the last animal, which is the keystone, also known as the apex predator. So the keystone species of the rainforest environment at MacRitchie Reservoir is the white-bellied fish eagle. And the scientific name of the eagle is Halieptus leucogaster. And so the reason for us to believe that these are the keystone species is because they eat a lot of the aquatic animals in the environment. Fish, turtles, sea snakes, birds, and some mammals. So again, the area where we couldn't go kind of had another little bit of an area for where the aquatic species would be. So we weren't able to go see like sea snakes or we didn't really see that many turtles. We did see one though, which was really cool. So yeah, because of the size of the animals that they're eating and sort of the status of the animals that they're eating, so they're eating all secondary consumers, it led us to believe that this would be the keystone species. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll catch you guys in the conclusion.
Bye.